This mountain is the most mysterious place on our planet. But do you know what's so shocking? There is very little research done on this site.
Every mountain on Earth has been conquered except one. Mount Kailash is not the tallest, not the deadliest, not even the hardest to climb. And yet, in 100 years of modern mountaineering, not one human being has ever stood on its summit. Every serious expedition ended the same way, not in tragedy. It simply stopped. For centuries, the Tibetan monks living in the monasteries at its base have known exactly why, written in handwritten texts they kept hidden and never explained to outsiders. Those texts describe a boundary zone and a chamber sealed inside the mountain. This is what they finally said. The mountain that breaks every rule. Mount Kailash rises in the remote Ngari region of far western Tibet, in a stretch of the Himalaya well away from the commercial routes that turned mountaineering into a global industry. At just over 6,600 meters, Kailash is not a giant. Everest stands nearly 9,000. K2 and Nanga Parbat, whose casualty records read more like war reports than climbing logs, have both been summited dozens of times. Kailash, by comparison, is not particularly tall, and by the honest assessment of the climbers who have actually studied its faces, it is not technically impossible either, and yet it remains the one significant peak in that entire mountain system that has never recorded a confirmed ascent, that breaks a pattern which holds almost everywhere else on this planet. Every other famous unclimbed summit on Earth belongs to something massive, brutal, and lethal, something that earned its record in bodies left where they fell. Unclimbed usually means unsurvivable. Kailash belongs to a completely different category. Understanding how takes the story somewhere stranger than difficulty ratings and weather windows. The shape, the water, and the men who never spoke. The mountain itself is where this begins to drift away from ordinary geology. Kailash rises with 4 distinct faces, each aligned almost perfectly with a cardinal direction: north, south, east, and west. That alignment gives the structure an unnervingly symmetrical, almost pyramidal shape, capped in snow and ice year-round, standing apart from the ridgelines around it. Explorers who documented the region in the early 20th century kept independently remarking on how unnaturally regular it looked from a distance, not jagged and chaotic like the peaks surrounding it, shaped by millions of years of random tectonic violence, but ordered, deliberate. Geologists have an explanation, and it is very likely the correct one. Specific erosion patterns acting on layered sedimentary rock across an immense span of time can produce steep, flat, regular faces. Nature builds straight lines far more often than people assume. But generation after generation of visitors, from entirely different centuries and cultures, with no contact with one another, all arrived independently at the same unsettling impression: that this mountain does not look like something that simply happened. That impression is what pushed a handful of researchers toward far more extreme conclusions. That Kailash was never a natural formation at all, but something built or positioned by forces we do not understand. The claim is repeated constantly online, usually with total confidence, so it is worth being direct. Mainstream geology and archaeology firmly reject that idea. No credible peer-reviewed survey has ever supported it. It belongs in the realm of fringe theory, not established fact. There are people who have never needed convincing. At the foot of that mountain sit monasteries occupied for centuries, where monks have lived within sight of those 4 faces for their entire lives. Inside them, according to accounts passed down through generations, are preserved handwritten texts describing what the mountain is and why nobody climbs it. For most of that history, nobody outside those walls was asking. Some held that silence for decades, through invasion, through upheaval, through the arrival of surveyors and cameras and eventually satellites. What those texts describe is the last thing this story will reach: time, a chamber, and something the monks admit they cannot fully translate. Before any of that, The geography alone is enough to make Kailash an outlier. The mountain sits at the headwaters of four of the largest river systems in Asia: the Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Sutlej, the Karnali, which feeds the Ganges. Each begins in roughly the same small region around the mountain, then flows outward in a completely different direction, eventually sustaining an estimated 2 billion people across South Asia. 2 billion lives, entire civilizations, cities, borders, and wars, all traceable back to meltwater that begins at the base of one modest peak in one of the emptiest corners of the continent. For much of the modern era, the precise origin points of these rivers were not reliably known. They were tangled in decades of conflicting colonial-era surveys and second-hand pilgrim accounts until sustained fieldwork by dedicated researchers finally pinned them down with certainty. A single, relatively unremarkable peak, functioning as the fountainhead for river systems that shape the fate of entire nations, is not replicated anywhere else on the continent, and ancient Hindu cosmology already described a mountain exactly like this: Mount Meru, the cosmic axis at the center of the universe, the origin point of four great rivers flowing outward in four directions from a single sacred center. Whether the ancient writers describing Meru were speaking purely in metaphor, or encoding real geographic knowledge passed down from a time long before anyone could have verified it from the air, is a question nobody has ever managed to answer. The description existed. The mountain matches it. That much is not in dispute, and it is where the religious dimension begins. Four faiths, one verdict. Kailash is not sacred to one tradition. It is sacred independently to four of the largest faith systems on Earth, each arriving at that conclusion through separate reasoning, in different languages, in different centuries. In Hinduism, Kailash is believed to be the eternal residence of Lord Shiva, seated in permanent meditation at the center of the world. The idea of a human foot touching that summit is treated not as trespassing, but as a direct disturbance of a living god. In Tibetan Buddhism, the mountain is identified with Mount Meru itself, the axis at the center of the cosmological universe, and the abode of a deity representing supreme bliss and spiritual realization. In Jainism, it is said that Rishabhanatha, the first Tirthankara and founding figure of the faith, achieved liberation on this exact mountain, arguably making it the most sacred site in that religion's history. And in the older indigenous Bon tradition of Tibet, which predates Buddhism in the region by centuries, Kailash is described as the literal point where heaven and earth connect, the axis mundi, the place where prayers rise and blessings descend. Four entirely distinct theological systems, different founders, different centuries, different languages, cosmologies that agree on almost nothing else about the nature of the universe or what happens after a human life ends. All of them arrived independently at the same conclusion about the same physical location. That is not one culture's local superstition. That is something much closer to consensus. Four religions that have argued with each other for 2,000 years, agreeing without discussion on one mountain, is the point where most explanations start running out of room. If that convergence is worth an hour of thought, subscribe. What follows is where the documented record starts behaving oddly, and where the monks stop being background and start speaking. The contest that set the rule, and the men who tested it. That consensus produced a taboo, and the story of how it was established is one of the most enduring legends in the region. Tibetan tradition holds that centuries ago, the mountain was contested between the arriving Buddhist faith and the older Bon religion that had governed the region before it. Spiritual authority over Kailash was the prize, and according to the legend, it was settled by a contest. The great Buddhist yogi Milarepa was challenged by a Bon practitioner named Naro Bon Chung. Whoever reached the summit first held the mountain. Naro Bon Chung set off at dawn, using a hand drum as a kind of magical vehicle, rising toward the peak with an unbeatable head start. Milarepa did nothing. He sat at the base in meditation, apparently unbothered, while his rival rose higher and higher. His own students reportedly panicked, convinced their teacher had already lost. Then, at the last possible moment, Milarepa ascended the entire mountain in a single instant, riding upward on a beam of morning sunlight, and arrived at the summit before his rival had even landed. Naro Bonchung was so shaken that his drum slipped from his hands and tumbled down the southern face. Pilgrims today still point to a long vertical scar there, said to be the mark it left behind. From that moment, the legend holds, the mountain belonged to Buddhism. But the detail that actually matters is not who won, it is how. Milarepa did not conquer the mountain by climbing it. He did not haul himself up rock and ice the way an ordinary man would. He transcended it entirely, setting the precedent that has governed Kailash ever since. The lesson passed down by monks for nearly 1,000 years has been unambiguous. This mountain is not meant to be climbed by anyone still bound to an ordinary human body and an ordinary human ego. Reaching that summit is not an achievement. It is a category error. For centuries, that remained a spiritual boundary, observed by people with no reason to test it. Then it met men who tested everything. As European surveyors worked through the Himalaya, cataloging and summiting one major peak after another, Kailash drew attention. Its modest height made it look, on paper, like an approachable target, something a competent team could tick off in a single season. And yet one attempt after another simply dissolved. In 1926, the British mountaineer Hugh Rutledge, who would later go on to lead major Everest expeditions, studied the mountain's north face in detail and concluded, in his own words, that it was utterly unclimbable. A striking judgment from a man who would spend much of his career throwing himself at one of the most dangerous ascents on the planet. Around the same period, another explorer surveyed the southern approach and believed he had found a viable route, only to be turned back by heavy snowfall before any serious attempt could be mounted. A decade later, in 1936, the Austrian explorer Herbert Tichy traveled through the region and asked a local lama directly whether the mountain could ever be climbed. The lama's answer has been repeated in nearly every serious account of the mountain since. Only a man entirely free of sin, he said, could climb Kailash. The phrasing is what carries, not a rule, not a prohibition, a plain statement of fact, delivered the way one describes something everyone in the room already understood, not something that is forbidden, something that does not happen. And the pattern behind that answer becomes difficult to write off. Every documented attempt to seriously approach Kailash as a climbing objective across a century of modern mountaineering ended the same way. Not in tragedy, not with a climber falling to their death, the way other unclimbed routes have claimed their victims. The attempts dissolved, turned back by weather, by unstable rock, by a route that looked promising from below, and then quietly stopped being viable the closer anyone got. Part of that is administrative. The Chinese government, which controls all access to the region through a strict permit system, has never issued a climbing permit for Kailash, not to a foreign expedition, not to a domestic one, not for scientific purposes, not for filming, not for anything. Every other major peak in the Tibetan Himalaya, including the north side of Everest, has a framework through which climbers can apply, pay, and legally attempt a summit. Kailash sits entirely outside that system, permanently, without exception. The unclimbed status is not enforced by one barrier, but by three, stacked on top of each other. A religious taboo spanning 4 faiths and nearly 1,000 years of continuous observance. A legal prohibition from the only government that controls the ground. And a voluntary code observed by the global mountaineering community itself, people who could, in theory, attempt it illegally, the way climbers have occasionally done elsewhere, and who by all available evidence essentially never have. Any one of those walls could be argued with. Together, they have held for a century, except once. In 2001, all three of them were tested at the same time. The expedition that stopped. A Spanish mountaineering team of elite climbers with prior experience on peaks including Everest and K2 received rare official permission to approach Kailash's summit. These were not amateurs looking for a novelty. They were professionals who had already stood in places where most people cannot breathe, who understood snow conditions and rockfall and the arithmetic of oxygen and time. They had planned for what mountains normally do. The reaction was immediate and international. Religious communities across Asia objected loudly and publicly. Petitions circulated. For millions of people across 4 faiths, this was not a sporting question at all. It was the announcement that strangers intended to walk onto the roof of a living God. And still the team traveled. Permits in hand, equipment prepared, they crossed the plain toward the base of that north face, the same wall Rutledge had stood beneath 75 years earlier and walked away from. They never reached the upper slopes. This is where the record becomes strange, precisely because nothing dramatic is in it. There was no storm, no technical obstacle, no equipment failure, no injury, no accident, no rescue. The attempt simply ended. The outcome is the only part that is documented, and it matches every attempt before it. The most qualified group ever to receive permission became one more entry in a century-long pattern of expeditions that dissolved rather than failed. Monks who have spoken about this describe something they call a return field, an invisible pressure that does not push a person backward, but produces an overwhelming, sudden internal certainty that they should not continue. Not fear, exactly. Not panic, certainty. What makes that striking is not that individuals feel anxious in a remote, high-altitude environment. That is normal and well understood. Thin air, isolation, and physical stress do strange things to human judgment, and every experienced climber knows it. What makes it strange is the pattern. Entire teams of highly experienced climbers, professionally trained to manage fear and push through discomfort, independently reporting that every member felt the same compulsion at the same moment, without discussing it first. The monks describe this not as the mountain attacking anyone, but as the mountain communicating with them. A signal, not a threat. Though what exactly that signal means, they openly admit they do not fully know. What they claim to know is written in the texts, and the texts are about time. The boundary zone and the texts. According to accounts passed down through generations of monks living near Kailash, ancient handwritten texts kept out of public view for centuries describe the mountain not merely as a sacred location, but as a fixed point where the flow of time itself becomes unstable. The monks reportedly call it an anchor point. The men who first wrote those texts were not poets weaving metaphor. By every account, they were disciplined observers who spent their lives in silence and careful study, and whose stated purpose was to record precisely what they witnessed among pilgrims who came too close to the upper slopes. What they recorded across texts written centuries apart is strikingly consistent. Pilgrims returning from close to the mountain sometimes showed physical changes that should not have been possible in the time they had been away. Hair and nail growth suggesting weeks had passed when only days had gone by. And in other cases, the exact opposite, a sense that time had stretched, that whole days had felt like a couple of hours. The texts describe what the monks call a boundary zone, an area roughly 15 kilometers out from the summit where these effects are said to begin, inside which the relationship between a person's inner sense of time and its actual passage becomes unreliable. It is worth being precise about what modern physics does and does not say here, because this is where these stories usually get abused. Einstein's theory of general relativity does confirm that time is not a fixed universal constant. Gravity genuinely bends space-time, and time genuinely passes at very slightly different rates